At 2:47 p.m. on a cold December afternoon in 1944, an American M4 Sherman sat hull down behind a low Belgian ridge, its crew listening to the distant rumble of German armor. Inside the cramped turret, a young loader from Nebraska, Private First Class Dale Hutchins, steadied himself against the recoil guard and tried to calm his breathing. The headphones pressed against his ears crackled with terse radio chatter, but one phrase cut through everything else. Tiger, range about 900 yards. Even without seeing it, he knew what that meant. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a German Tiger heavy tank had just turned its long 88mm barrel in their direction. The numbers were painfully familiar to everyone who had been fighting in Europe. Thick frontal armor on the Tiger, a 75mm gun on the Sherman, and a margin for error that was essentially zero. On paper, the situation was almost comically uneven. The front of the Tiger was layered with heavy protection. The Sherman's gun, especially with standard ammunition at typical combat ranges, struggled to make an impression on that front plate. Training manuals, lectures, and whispered advice from veterans all said the same thing. Do not try to trade frontal shots with a Tiger. If you see one, call for air support, call for specialized tank destroyers, and if none of that is available, try to circle around and aim for the sides. But that winter around the town of Bastogne, air support was grounded, visibility was poor, and specialized units were spread thin. The weather and the terrain had turned theory into a luxury. In practice, crews like Hutchins often found themselves facing Tigers with nothing but their own Shermans and whatever ideas they could bring to the fight. Dale's tank commander, Sergeant Bill Cadell, scanned over the ridge through his binoculars. The gunner, Corporal Sam Blake, had his eye pressed to the sight, searching for the hint of grey armor among the snow-dusted fields. Dale waited with an armor-piercing round in his hands, feeling the cool metal of the casing even through his gloves. He knew the common sequence by heart. The Sherman spots the Tiger. The commander orders a move for a flank. The Tiger crew sees the movement first. A flash, a distant boom, and then a Sherman knocked out before it can do more than traverse its turret. Dale had already watched that sequence play out twice in the past 2 weeks. The first time, it had taken one of his closest friends, a loader from Arizona whose laughter had once filled the barracks. The second time, it had taken his platoon leader, a calm officer who had seemed unshakable until the day his tank never answered the radio again. Each time, the pattern had been the same. The Shermans did what doctrine demanded: maneuver, avoid frontal duels, try to outflank the Tiger. Each time, the Tiger's gun fired first. Each time, the American crews were the ones who did not return. Sitting in the gunner's seat now, Blake whispered over the intercom that he had the Tiger in sight. The enemy tank was slightly angled but still showing most of its formidable front armor. At this distance, a single American round on that heavy plate would do little more than leave a mark. Dale tightened his grip on the shell. He knew something that doctrine did not emphasize. It was not written in field manuals or presented in briefings. It was a lesson from a farm workshop half a world away, passed from father to son over tractors and plows rather than tanks and guns. On the family farm in Nebraska, his father had taught him that metal treated as solid and unchanging was only half understood. When you strike the same spot again and again, tiny cracks begin to form beneath the surface. They are invisible at first, but they spread. What once seemed unbreakable gradually becomes vulnerable. To most of the world, a Tiger's front armor was a fortress. To a farm mechanic used to coaxing worn steel back to life, it was something else, a stubborn piece of metal that could, under the right conditions, be persuaded to yield. Theoretically, if you could land multiple rounds on nearly the same point of that front armor, the first impact would start a pattern of stress in the steel. The second would deepen it. The third might finally push through. The problem was simple and enormous at the same time. On a real battlefield, hitting almost the exact same small area 3 times in a row on a moving target was considered nearly impossible. Sherman's sights were good but not magical. Crosshairs gave a reference, not a precise coordinate grid. Recoil, movement, terrain, and return fire all made repeat placement incredibly difficult. The first shot might land somewhere high on the armor. The second would likely drift to one side. By the time a third was ready, the enemy would often have already responded decisively. Dale had spent the last days turning this problem over in his mind whenever the engine noise quieted and there was a moment to think. Each time he imagined the first round striking the Tiger, he imagined something else, a way to mark that point, to frame it visually so clearly that the gunner could adjust with precision for the next shot. He needed a reference that would come to life only in the instant of firing, something that would briefly glow and outline where the shell had landed. He needed a guide that could turn a flash that lasted less than a second into usable information. 2 days earlier, while leaning over the engine deck with a wrench in his hand, he had glanced down at his tool bag and seen a coil of thin, flexible wire. It was the same type of ordinary steel wire farmers used to bind bales or secure loose panels. It was unremarkable in every way, except that Dale suddenly realized what it could become. If he could mount short segments of that wire around the gun mantlet in a simple pattern, then, when the main gun fired, the muzzle flash would light those wires up. For the briefest moment, they would glow, creating a bright frame in the gunner's field of vision. The point where the shell struck the enemy armor could then be judged relative to that glowing frame. Too high. Adjust down. Too far to one side. Correct the other way. Repeat until 3 rounds had impacted nearly the same point. The idea felt almost ridiculous when it first formed in his mind, a farmer's fix grafted onto advanced machinery. Yet the more he pictured it, the more it made sense. It did not change the gun. It did not alter the shell. It did not require any new technology. It simply gave the gunner more information, precisely when he needed it most. The challenge was not whether it would work in theory. The challenge was whether he dared to attach anything at all to the exterior of a combat vehicle without permission. Regulations on such things were not vague. Unauthorized changes to armor, turret faces, or machine components were strictly forbidden. The logic was simple. An improvised addition could snag on obstacles, interfere with turret rotation, or compromise a carefully balanced design. The consequences for such modifications could include serious disciplinary action. But as Dale stood in that maintenance area 2 nights before the encounter near Bastogne, listening to the distant murmur of generators and the low idle of engines, raw fear of regulations competed with another memory, the silence that had followed his friend's last radio calls. He weighed both in his mind. Then he picked up the wire. He did not yet know that a few days later, on a Belgian ridge, that stupid piece of farm hardware would be the difference between watching another Sherman vanish from the net and doing something that most crews had been taught was simply not possible. He only knew that he was tired of watching the same pattern repeat itself, and that he might have found a way, however small, to change it. The maintenance area on the edge of the bivouac looked almost peaceful from a distance. Parked Shermans sat in dark rows, silhouettes against the faint winter sky. Up close, though, the scene was all hard edges and chilled metal. The air smelled of oil and exhaust, and a thin layer of frost coated every surface the shadows could reach. It was into this muted world that Dale slipped late that night, carrying a small bundle under his arm. The coil of wire inside was nothing special, salvaged from a shipping crate. It was the sort of thing most people would use to tie down tarps or secure equipment. Dale had straightened and measured it earlier, cutting it into 4 matching lengths. He knew exactly where each piece needed to go. Climbing up onto the hull of his Sherman, he felt the metal bite through his gloves with winter cold. The turret loomed above him, familiar and solid, the gun mantlet protruding like a shield. Dale had spent countless hours inside this machine, loading shells, checking breech blocks, and wiping condensation from the walls. Tonight, for the first time, he stood on the outside with the intention of changing how it looked. He unfolded a small welding kit he had borrowed from the maintenance crew, careful not to draw attention. The generator that powered his tools coughed to life with a low, uneven tone. He winced at the noise, then relaxed slightly as he realized it blended with the distant rumble of other engines. His plan was simple. Each wire segment would be welded directly onto the turret face around the gun mantlet, forming a rough rectangle. 1 along the upper left, 1 on the upper right, and 2 mirroring them below. Together they would create a glowing frame when the gun fired, a pattern the gunner could use as a reference for correcting his aim. Still crouched on the hull, Dale held the first piece in place, adjusting its angle again and again until he was confident it would not obstruct the periscope or snag on anything. He ignited the torch, and the blue-white flare of heat illuminated the side of the turret. For a moment, the tank looked almost alive, splashed with moving light and shadow. Each time he struck an arc, he paused to glance toward the command tents. No one appeared. Guards posted on the perimeter were focused outward, scanning for any sign of enemy movement. Inside the warmth of the headquarters, officers were either planning for the next day's operations or trying to steal a few hours of sleep. Up on the turret, Dale's world had narrowed to the hiss of the torch, the faint drip of melted metal, and the ticking of cooling steel. It took longer than he expected to secure the first segment. He needed it firmly attached, but not warped or misaligned. A crooked reference line would do more harm than good. When he finally stepped back, he could barely see the result in the poor light, just a thin grey strip hugging the curve of the mantlet. From ground level, it would be nearly invisible. The remaining 3 segments went on faster. His hands, though stiff from the cold, began to find a rhythm. Upper right, then lower left, then lower right. Each had to match the others in length and position, creating a frame that would make geometric sense when seen through the gunner's sight. By the time he finished, several hours had passed. The generator had settled into a quieter tone. The frost on the tank had melted in small patches around his work and then begun to reform. Dale switched off the torch, coiled the remaining wire, and climbed down carefully, feeling his legs complain after so much time spent balanced on narrow surfaces. He walked away from the tank and turned to look at it from a distance. In the dim light, his Sherman looked exactly like every other one in the line. The gun barrel pointed slightly upward, the turret squat and stable. Only someone who knew exactly what to look for would notice the slim, L-shaped outlines welded around the gun mantlet. To anyone else, they might appear to be extra brackets for camouflage netting, or some odd field repair. They did not look like the centerpiece of a plan to give a standard medium tank a fighting chance against one of the most feared armored vehicles in the theater. Stowing the welding gear, Dale returned the generator to its original place and checked that nothing looked out of order. His heart still beat a little faster than usual, not from exertion, but from the quiet knowledge that he had just committed a clear act of unauthorized modification. If a strict inspection caught his changes, there would be questions. Why did you do this? Who told you it was allowed? Did you consider the risk of damaging the turret or interfering with its operation? The answers would not sound very convincing in a formal setting. "I thought it might help us stay alive" did not fit comfortably into regulatory language. Back in his tent, he settled into his sleeping bag but found no rest. The image of the wire frame lingered in his thoughts. He imagined the gun firing, the wires lighting up in an instant, and the gunner calling out, "high left," or "low center," with confidence. He replayed in his mind how a series of 3 shots might walk into the same tiny area of armor instead of scattering across a broad steel wall. Then other images came: burnt-out hulls sitting alone in snowy fields, radio channels going suddenly silent, familiar voices cut off mid-sentence. These were not scenes from imagination. They were memories from the last weeks of combat. He thought of his friend who had never returned from a mission near a small Belgian village. He thought of his platoon leader's calm voice on the net one day and the empty static the next. He thought of how, in every after-action talk, the pattern had been the same. The Shermans had tried to do what they were told, and the Tigers had simply been faster, better protected, and unforgiving. The idea that a few pieces of wire could push back against that reality felt almost arrogant. Yet he could not shake the feeling that it was worth trying. It did not require the approval of engineers in distant offices. It required only a welder, some salvaged material, and the willingness to take a personal risk. As the dim light outside his tent slowly began to shift toward dawn, the rumble of engines stirred again. Tanks were coming to life, crews pulling on jackets and climbing into their positions. The day's orders would soon be passed down. Patrols, reconnaissance, and the ever-present possibility of running headlong into German armor. Dale exhaled slowly, sat up, and laced his boots. Whether his idea mattered or not, he would find out soon. He had not told anyone about the modification. There had been no time, and he had no desire to invite early judgment. The first opinions that truly mattered would be those of the men who sat in the same steel compartment as he did, facing the same dangers. He stepped out into the cold morning air, saw the tank line, and felt his eyes drawn immediately to his Sherman. It looked unchanged, which was exactly what he wanted. The wires were there, waiting for the first flash to prove whether they held any value beyond a farm boy's imagination. He climbed aboard with the rest of the crew and slid into his familiar place near the breech. The smell of oil, metal, and canvas surrounded him. The interior walls had the scuffs and dents of weeks in combat. The intercom crackled to life as Cordell began checking in with each crew position. Driver, check. Driver up. Gunner. Gunner up. Loader. Dale rested a gloved hand on the nearest shell and answered. Loader up. No one had mentioned the wires yet. No one had had a reason to. That was about to change. The first person to notice the modification from inside was not Dale, but Sam Blake. The gunner slid into his seat, adjusted his sight, and began the usual routine of checking his field of vision. As he peered through the optics, something unfamiliar edged into view around the gun barrel. He frowned and shifted his head slightly, trying to determine what had changed. Thin, Pale lines traced an unexpected pattern at the edge of his sight picture. He pulled back, climbed halfway up to the hatch, and then leaned forward again to look carefully. "Sergeant," Blake's voice came through the intercom, measured but puzzled. "I'm seeing something around the mantlet. Looks like wire or brackets. 4 of them." Cordell, standing partially out of the commander's hatch scanning the early light, paused and glanced down. "What kind of wire?" he asked. "Hard to tell from here," Blake replied. "Looks welded on. Like a frame." Cordell muttered something under his breath and dropped inside, tapping Dale on the shoulder. "Loader, what did our tank grow overnight?" he asked, not hiding his suspicion. Dale had expected this moment. He knew there was no way the gunner could miss 4 welded lines encircling his primary tool. Lying would only postpone the inevitable. "I added a guide, Sergeant," Dale said, choosing his words carefully. "Around the mantlet. 4 pieces. It's meant to help Sam see where the first round lands. When we fire, the flash should light them up. For a second, he'll see a kind of frame. If the hit is high or off to one side, he can correct exactly for the next shot." There was a pause on the net, long enough for everyone in the crew to feel it. "Let me get this straight," Cordell said. "You welded wire to my turret without telling me, and you're hoping nobody notices until we fire in front of people who write reports for a living?" "Yes, Sergeant," Dale answered honestly. "I figured if I asked first, it would never happen. I know it's not regulation, but I think it can help." "How exactly?" Blake asked, still staring through his optics, curiosity now overtaking confusion. Dale described the concept as clearly as he could. He explained the farm lessons about repeated impact on the same spot, how stress could build inside metal even when the surface looks solid. He talked through the idea of 3 shots in quick succession, landing as close to one another as possible. The wires, he said, were nothing more than a reference system, a way to turn the brief glow of firing into useful feedback. "It's basic geometry," he finished quietly. "If your first round spark hits high and inside the upper right corner, you know exactly how to adjust. We don't have to guess where it landed. We can walk the next ones into the same point." Silence followed again. Out beyond the tank, engines idled, and tracks clanked as other crews moved into formation. Inside the Sherman, the air seemed to hold still. Finally, Cordell let out a short breath. "You realize this is the kind of thing that gets people called into offices," he said. "If someone up the chain decides it's unsafe or unauthorized, the paperwork won't be fun." "I know," Dale replied. "But if it does what I think it can do, maybe they'll care more about the results than the wiring." Cordell did not answer right away. Instead, he climbed up through the hatch and stepped onto the turret, running a gloved hand over the welded segments. From up close he could see the care that had gone into their placement. They were thin, low profile, and welded cleanly. They did not interfere with the turret ring, the coaxial machine gun, or any of the vision ports. He imagined the flash of the gun lighting them for an instant. He imagined a tiger in the distance, its ancient oak-like front armor turned toward them with quiet confidence. If this little trick gave his gunner even a fraction more control over shot placement, was it worth the risk of someone objecting later? He slid back into the turret and closed the hatch partway, leaving enough space to speak clearly. "All right," he said at last. "Here's how we'll play it. We don't advertise this to anyone unless they ask. If it helps, we are better off. If it doesn't, we are no worse than we were yesterday. Understood?" "Understood," Blake said. "Yes, Sergeant," Dale replied. "Then let's hope," Cordell added, "that the first people to test this idea are not also the last ones who get to tell the story." The columns of the company formed up along a frozen farm track. 18 Shermans moved out in staggered spacing, their engines humming in a dissonant chorus. Fields stretched out on either side, the ground hard and pale under a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Clusters of bare trees marked the edges of property lines. Here and there, low stone walls peeked through the snow. The radio net filled with clipped instructions as the formation advanced. Intelligence reports had warned of German armor moving along certain routes, but the exact locations were uncertain. That uncertainty carried its own weight in the turret. Every dip in the terrain, every small rise, might conceal something much larger and far more dangerous. Dale fell into his familiar rhythm as the tank moved. He checked the ammunition rack, counted the ready rounds, and mentally rehearsed the sequence of motion. Grab, load, close, brace. His world, when the shooting started, would compress to the space around the breach and the voice of the gunner calling for specific types of shells. At 8:43 a.m., a terse report cut through the net. Contact. Multiple heavy tanks. Front. Likely Tigers. Range roughly 2,000 yards. Cordell immediately ordered the driver to shift toward the nearest ridge and find a position where only the upper portion of the Sherman would be exposed. The tank settled behind the rise, its hull hidden, only the turret and gun showing. The distance was still too great for any hope of effective fire on the Tiger's front. Other Shermans scattered into similar positions, trying to angle themselves so that if German guns opened up, they would at least present partial targets rather than their full profiles. As the Tigers rolled closer, the difference in their design philosophy was obvious even at range. They moved with a certain ponderous confidence, the boxy turrets swinging with deliberate grace. Their crews had good reason to trust their machines. For months, these heavy tanks had dominated most frontal exchanges, their armor shrugging off impacts that would have knocked out lesser vehicles. When one of them turned slightly, presenting more of its front than its side, Cordell recognized an opportunity, however slim. "Tiger, 11 o'clock, he called. About 1,400 yards. Moving left to right. Sam, can you see it?" "Got it," Blake replied. "He's mostly frontal. That's heavy plate." "We are not getting a better look than this," Cordell said. "Take your chance. Loader, armor piercing." "Up," Dale answered, sliding the round smoothly into the breech and locking it with a solid push. In that moment, the entire experiment with the wireframe converged into one decision. The crew was about to discover whether the farm-born concept could match even a fraction of the hope Dale had attached to it. "On the way," Blake said, settling into his sight picture. The Sherman's main gun roared. Inside, the turret filled with a brief thunder, followed instantly by the mechanical clank of the recoiling mechanism. The casing spun back out and crashed onto the deck near Dale's feet. The familiar taste of propellant hung in the air. Through his sight, Blake saw the distant impact. The round struck the Tiger's frontal plate, sending a small burst of sparks across the armor. It did not penetrate. That part was expected. What caught his breath was not the hit itself, but the frame around it. For a fraction of a second, as the gun fired, the wires welded to the turret face flared into bright, glowing lines in his peripheral vision. They formed a four-sided frame, and in that brief illumination, Blake could see exactly where the impact point sat relative to those glowing edges. "High right," he said immediately, about a little above the lower right segment. "Second round," Cordell ordered. "Do it again." Dale already had the next shell in his hands. The second round slid into the breech with a practice shove. The motion had become nearly instinctive for Dale, refined by weeks of drilling and real engagements. He closed the breech with a firm pull and tapped Blake's shoulder. "Up," he announced. Blake adjusted with calm precision. He remembered the brief flash from the first shot, how the glowing frame had highlighted the offset. He shifted his sights slightly down and left, fine-tuning the crosshairs until they pointed back to the same area where the initial impact had appeared, but corrected along both axes. He exhaled, steadied himself against the familiar vibrations of the tank, and squeezed the trigger. Again, the interior of the Sherman vibrated with the force of the shot. Again, a casing clattered to the floor, rolling against Dale's boot. Through the scope, Blake watched the second shell trace its path across the air and meet the same patch of German armor. This time, the spark of impact flared nearly where the first had, close enough that he did not need to say much. "Same place," he reported, his voice sharper now. "Almost on top of the first hit." Inside the metal of the Tiger's front plate, stress lines that were invisible to the eye began to spread and connect. On the outside, nothing dramatic showed yet, just two faint marks where shells had struck. Dale was already in motion, pulling another round from the rack. His arms moved faster now. There was no time to think about anything except the sequence: grab, seat, close, signal. He felt the familiar scrape of metal on metal as the third shell settled into the chamber. "Up," he said again, not letting a single second go to waste. Outside, the Tiger's turret made a small adjustment of its own, searching for the American hull-down positions. Somewhere inside, a German gunner was going through his own practice motions. That race between two crews, between two sets of hands separated by hundreds of yards and opposing uniforms, contained in it the fate of both machines. Blake once more placed his eye to the sight. He knew he did not have long. He needed this third shot to land where physics could finally do what courage and training alone could not. The Sherman fired. For the third time, the thin wires around the mantlet flashed like a makeshift constellation. For the third time, Blake watched their glow frame the path of his shot. The shell flew true, aimed at the same stressed location where its predecessors had struck. This time, the reaction was different. At that distance, they could not hear the sound of impact over their own gun, but they saw the result. The Tiger shuddered, as if something inside had been jolted loose. A darker plume rose from its hull, and its forward motion faltered. It no longer advanced with the same assurance. Instead, it braked slightly, then rolled to a reluctant stop. Through the sight, Blake saw hatches move, smoke filtering out as the crew inside tried to respond to a sudden change they had not expected. The front armor that had already shrugged off so many single hits had finally met 3 closely grouped impacts in rapid sequence, and the accumulation had done what one shell alone could not. "Target is stopping," Blake reported. "He's not moving." Cordell's voice came through the intercom with a mixture of surprise and something harder to define. "Stay on him. Watch for any movement. Driver, hold position." For a few seconds, the whole crew listened, hearing only the sound of their own engine and the distant rumble of other tanks. No return fire snapped into the ridge in front of them. No plume of earth or snow leapt up from a countershot. Other Shermans reported their own engagements over the net. Some called out hits on enemy vehicles from different angles. Others requested adjustments to their position. In that swirl of communication, Blake's observation cut through. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "we just stopped a Tiger from the front." Inside the turret, his words hung there, not quite a celebration, not yet a conclusion. Instead, they were a statement of fact that contradicted an entire season of experience. Cordell took a moment before responding. "Loader," he said, directing his voice toward Dale, "remind me again whose idea that wire was." "Mine, Sergeant," Dale answered, his hands still resting on the stacks of remaining shells. "Then for now," Cordell replied, "don't mention it to anyone unless they ask first. We'll see if this was a one-time miracle or something we can rely on." He did not need to tell the crew what they already felt. The wires had made a difference. Without them, the second shot might have landed too far off. The third might have gone elsewhere. It was one thing to know in theory that repeated hits in the same area could gradually undermine armor. It was another thing entirely to be able to do it in practice, under pressure, with a moving target and limited time. For the rest of that engagement, the crew found themselves looking at their tank differently. The Sherman was still a medium machine, still outmatched one-on-one in many ways by heavy armor like the Tiger. Its engine did not suddenly gain extra horsepower, and its armor did not thicken by a single millimeter. But inside, there was a new awareness that their main gun, paired with a simple visual aid, could produce results that had previously seemed out of reach. Later in the same action, another Tiger presented itself at a more oblique angle. This time, the crew worked with less uncertainty. They engaged with the same careful rhythm: first shell for contact and frame, second for refinement, third to exploit the compromised area if the situation allowed. Not every shot produced the same dramatic outcome. Some enemy vehicles withdrew or shifted behind cover sooner. Some engagements were broken off as terrain and orders changed. Yet each time the wires glowed, Blake's corrections became more precise, and the crew's confidence grew just a little more. By the time they returned to the makeshift tank park that afternoon, the story had already begun to spread. Radio traffic had carried snippets of their conversation across the battalion net. Other crews had heard references to those wires around the gun and the way they helped track hits. When Dale climbed down from a Sherman, his legs unsteady from hours inside a moving steel compartment, he saw a small group waiting near their parking slot. Several other tank commanders and gunners approached, their expressions a mix of curiosity and urgency. "What did you put on your turret?" one of them asked without preamble. "We heard something on the net. Something about a frame." Cordell stepped in, giving Dale a brief look that said everything. The time for secrecy, at least within their own circle, had passed. He welded a reference grid, Cordell explained. 4 pieces of wire. They glow when the gun fires. Our gunner can see exactly where the first shell hits relative to that frame. Helps line up the second and third shots in close. "And it worked?" another commander asked. "We just watched a Tiger slow to a stop after a set like that," Cordell replied, careful not to sound overly triumphant. "You can draw your own conclusions." One of the gunners shook his head slowly, half in disbelief, half in appreciation. "So all we needed," he said, was a farm kid with a welding torch. Dale shifted his weight, suddenly aware that more eyes were on him than he was comfortable with. "I just didn't want us to keep repeating the same pattern," he said. "If there's a way to give the next round a better chance, I think we should take it." The men around him absorbed that quietly. They had all lost people recently. They all carried mental lists of names that once called back over the radio and now did not. The idea that something so small and unassuming could tilt even a fraction of those encounters in their favor was not something they were going to ignore. That evening, as the temperature dropped and the sky darkened once again, the maintenance area was not nearly as empty as it had been the night before. This time, Dale was not welding alone. Several loaders and mechanics gathered around other Shermans, measuring, cutting, and attaching their own sets of wire segments. They worked quickly but carefully, using lessons he had learned in that first risky attempt. Each frame had to be placed correctly to be useful. Each had to be sturdy enough to withstand the vibration of repeated firing. No officer had yet given formal approval. No directive had been issued. Still, the modification spread from tank to tank with a speed that no piece of official paperwork could match. Over the next week, the wire frames quietly multiplied. At first, only a handful of tanks in Dale's battalion sported the subtle rectangles welded around their gun mantlets. Then more crews joined in, encouraged by stories from early engagements where the visual aid had helped concentrate fire. The work always happened at the edges of the day, in the grey areas when the line between authorized maintenance and creative improvisation blurred. Mechanics who had initially raised their eyebrows at the idea soon became willing partners. They appreciated simple, field-expedient solutions that did not require waiting for parts or external approval. Dale found himself spending more time with a welding torch than he ever expected when he joined the armored forces. He moved from turret to turret, checking angles and distances, making sure each wire frame would appear in roughly the same place inside the gunner's view. Word traveled informally. A loader from another company would pass by, hear a brief description of the modification, and return to his own crew with a spark of interest. A platoon sergeant, initially skeptical, would listen to a gunner describe how much more confident he felt placing his second and third shots. Once a couple of such accounts accumulated, resistance softened. The frontline nature of the innovation meant it adapted quickly to practical realities. Some crews added slight variations to the frame, adjusting the length or the bend to suit their specific sight picture. Others experimented with slightly thicker or thinner wire to see what glowed best without obstructing any instrument. No two installations were perfectly identical, but all shared the same basic principle: give the gunner an illuminated reference structure for rapid correction. The next significant engagement that showcased the impact of this collective tinkering occurred not long after, again amid the patchwork fields and narrow roads of the Ardennes. This time, more Shermans rolled into action with wireframes already in place. The crews no longer treated the modification as a curiosity. For many, it had become an integral part of their gunnery process. When German armor appeared on the horizon, the familiar tension surged through the formations. Commands snapped across the radio net: "Take cover, button up, align on that ridge." Tanks shifted behind risers and hedges, presenting as small a profile as possible while still maintaining good lines of sight. Reports of tigers among the opposing vehicles sharpened everyone's attention. Each crew knew the challenges those heavy tanks posed. Yet the men inside the modified Shermans carried with them a quiet, newly formed confidence. Not that they were suddenly invincible, but that they had an additional tool that might narrow the gap. As the distance closed and both sides began to trade fire, patterns from earlier battles began to shift. Instead of scattered impacts glancing off heavy armor, some of the American rounds began to cluster more tightly. Gunners used the wireframes to lock onto previous hit locations. Loaders, now well practiced in rapid sequences, moved shells into the breach faster than ever. Not every encounter ended in favor of the Shermans, and not every tiger was stopped by 3 rapid impacts. Terrain, angles, and the inevitable chaos of battle ensured that outcomes remained unpredictable. But observers on the ground and in command posts began to notice something that could not be dismissed. Heavy German tanks that had previously shrugged off long-range frontal fire were now sometimes being forced to halt, retreat, or be abandoned after a series of highly concentrated hits. In debriefings, gunners describe how the wireframes had turned those brief flashes at the moment of firing into meaningful data. They told their officers how, instead of guessing where the first round had landed on a distant silhouette, they could now say with confidence, high center, or slightly left of middle, and adjust accordingly. It would have been difficult to quantify the exact impact of this change in the heat of ongoing operations, but for the crews involved, the difference felt very real. Within the battalion, the story of how the modification had started was still mostly kept among those directly involved. Officially, the tanks were simply becoming more effective as crews gained experience. Unofficially, loaders and mechanics knew that a farm-born idea was quietly reshaping how their units approached encounters with the heaviest enemy armor. The more the wireframe spread, however, the harder it became to keep them entirely out of view of high-ranking officers. Commanders visiting the tank lines noticed the unusual welded shapes. Some assumed they were part of a standardized field kit. Others asked pointed questions. One evening, as Dale was double-checking the frame on a neighboring Sherman, a staff officer approached with a clipboard in hand. He was not from the battalion. His insignia marked him as belonging to a higher-level headquarters unit. His eyes tracked the welded wires with interest. "What's the purpose of those additions?" he asked. The crew exchanged a glance. Cordell answered, choosing a matter-of-fact tone. "Aiming reference, sir," he said. "Helps the gunner track where his first round lands. We've seen some good results against armored targets." The officer jotted something down, nodded, and moved to the next tank. There, he saw similar frames. After the fourth or fifth instance, he stopped writing and simply took it in. When he left, the crew breathed a quiet sigh of relief. No reprimands had been issued. No immediate orders had come to remove the modifications. Instead, there had been curiosity, perhaps even a hint of approval. But curiosity at that level rarely stopped at a few notes on a clipboard. A few days later, that curiosity took a more concrete form. A senior commander known for his attention to detail arrived unexpectedly at the armored unit's position. His visits usually focused on readiness, discipline, and the general state of vehicles and crews. This time, as he walked along the line of tanks with a small entourage, something else caught his attention. On one turret after another, he saw the same distinct detail, for subtle, welded segments framing the gun mantlet. He stopped at the first Sherman and ran his fingers along the cool metal. Then he moved to the next tank, saw the same addition, and then the next. By the time he reached the end of the row, he had counted well over a dozen vehicles with nearly identical modifications. Turning to the battalion maintenance chief, he asked a direct question. Who authorized these changes? The maintenance chief, a seasoned non-commissioned officer who had seen his share of paperwork and improvisation, answered honestly. "No formal authorization, sir," he said. "It started as a field adjustment. Crews have been fitting them themselves. We've let it continue because we are seeing better performance from the tanks that have them." The commander studied him for a moment, then pointed back at the nearest turret. "Was this your idea?" The chief shook his head. "No, sir. It came from one of the loaders originally, Private First Class Hutchins." "Find him," the commander said simply. Minutes later, Dale stood at attention beside his tank, surrounded by machinery he knew intimately and officers he did not. The senior commander regarded him with a measured gaze, taking in the young man's worn jacket, grease-marked gloves, and steady posture. "Private," he began, "I'm told you are responsible for the wire frames on these tanks. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Dale replied. "I installed the first one on this vehicle and helped others with theirs." "You understand," the commander continued, "that altering a combat vehicle without prior approval is not something we encourage. You also understand that if this modification had interfered with your turret's operation or visibility, the consequences could have been serious." "Yes, sir," Dale said again. "I accepted that risk when I did it." "Then why did you do it?" The question hung there between them. It was not asked in anger, but with genuine interest. The mechanics nearby paused their work, listening without trying to appear to do so. Dale took a breath. "Because, sir," he said, "we were facing heavy tanks that our doctrine told us not to engage from the front. But we didn't always have a choice. I knew from working with metal back home that repeated impact on the same point can weaken steel. I thought if we could place 3 rounds nearly on top of one another on the same section of armor, we might have a chance." He glanced up at the turret as he spoke, the welded wire segments catching his eye. "The wires are just a way to help the gunner see exactly where the first round lands," he continued. "They light up when we fire. For a moment, he sees a frame in his sight. That lets him correct the next shot. It's not fancy equipment. It's just a clearer way to use what we already have." The commander studied his expression, looking for any hint of exaggeration. Finding none, he shifted his attention to the maintenance chief. "Have you seen evidence that this works?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the chief replied. "We've reviewed engagements where crews with frames were able to concentrate hits more effectively. Reports mention heavy enemy tanks halting or being abandoned after multiple close impacts. The crews themselves believe the frames make a measurable difference." The commander remained quiet for a few heartbeats. The cold air seemed to hold every sound: the distant clank of tools, the murmur of engines idling, and the faint crunch of boots on frozen ground. Finally, he turned back to Dale. "If I had come here yesterday," he said, "and this had not worked, your day would be going very differently right now. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." "But it appears," the commander went on, "that your idea has contributed to improved performance against some of the toughest armored opponents we face. I value results. I also value initiative when it actually helps us win." He let that sink in, then added, "I am not going to order these removed. In fact, I am instructing the maintenance section to fit frames like these on the remaining tanks in this battalion. You will assist them. Consider that your temporary specialty." Dale's shoulders relaxed just a fraction. The thought that the modification might be not only tolerated but actively expanded had seemed too much to hope for just days earlier. "Yes, sir," he answered. The commander nodded once. "Private," he said, "you didn't wait for a committee. You saw a problem and tried to solve it with what you had. That can be dangerous when done carelessly. But done with thought and skill, it can also save lives. Next time you have an idea this significant, bring it to your chain of command sooner. In this case, you've been fortunate, and so has your unit." With that, he moved on to inspect other aspects of the battalion, leaving behind a maintenance crew that now had clear instructions and a loader turned unofficial advisor on a very specific piece of field engineering. From that point on, the pace of frame installation changed. It was no longer a quiet, after-hours project conducted under the cover of dim lights. Mechanics worked in the open, welding kits humming as they traced the now familiar pattern around turret mantlets. Crews lined up their tanks and waited for their turn, eager to receive the same enhancement they had heard so much about. The mood in the vehicle park took on a new energy. Men who had shared stories of hard encounters with Tigers now shared tips on how best to position the wires, how to check that they glowed clearly in firing tests, and how to incorporate their presence into training routines for new gunners. At firing ranges behind the front lines, instructors began including references to the frames in their briefings. They told replacement crews how to use the momentary glow to judge dispersion and adjust their aim. What had started as a single, unauthorized modification now began to settle into the shape of an emerging practice. While all of this unfolded, Dale himself remained surprisingly reserved about his role. He explained the frames matter-of-factly when asked. He demonstrated how to attach them and how to align them with the gun sight. But he never spoke about the idea as if it was something grand. To him, it was simply the best way he could see to address a problem that had been putting his friends in impossible situations. If it helped reduce the number of tanks coming back empty, if it meant fewer radios going silent mid-battle, then it had done what he hoped. The official paperwork that would later pass through staff offices and engineering departments would tell its own version of the story. For now, in this frozen corner of Europe, the verdict that mattered most came from the crews who climbed into their Shermans each morning, adjusted their helmets, and felt just a little less exposed when someone said, "Tiger spotted." As winter wore on, the wireframes appeared on more and more Shermans across neighboring units. Field workshops became informal hubs of knowledge exchange. A mechanic from one division would visit another, notice the frames, ask a few practical questions, and then carry the concept back to his own crews. In many ways, the idea traveled the same way rumors did, through conversations, shared experience, and a desire to find any advantage that might help. Reports from the front lines began to reflect subtle shifts in the pattern of engagements. Units that had previously avoided frontal exchanges against heavy armor now sometimes chose to hold their ground a little more firmly, especially when terrain made flanking risky or impossible. When they did engage, narratives described clustered impacts instead of scattered ones, and heavy enemy vehicles being forced to withdraw more frequently than before. Commanders, reading these reports, might not have seen all the underlying details. To them, it could appear that crews were simply becoming more proficient with experience. The reality was more layered. Experience mattered, certainly, but so did the quiet collaboration between field ingenuity and day-to-day necessity. Inside the Shermans, the frames quickly became part of normal crew vocabulary. Gunners would mention them in passing during briefings. Watch the frame on first shot, call your correction. Loaders took pride in the fact that a fellow loader had contributed something tangible to the way they fought. For men whose roles were often seen as purely mechanical, the notion that one of their own had helped shape tactics felt quietly affirming. Not all interactions with the modification were smooth. A few crews, new to the idea, found it distracting at first. The sudden flare of lines in the sight picture took some getting used to. Training sessions allowed them to practice under controlled conditions, firing at distant targets and watching the wires glow, until their brains began to treat the momentary light as information rather than interruption. For Dale, each new tank that received a frame was both a point of pride and a reminder of why he had started this journey. He watched other men take up welding torches with the same care he had used. He heard them discuss adjustments to the length or thickness of the wire based on visibility tests. The modification was no longer his alone. It belonged to the crews collectively now. Away from the front, in offices filled with map-covered tables and stacks of reports, staff officers within the broader armored command structure started to notice patterns as well. Statistical summaries showed an improvement in outcomes when certain units engaged heavy enemy tanks. Someone, somewhere, asked the natural question, what are they doing differently? Requests went out for descriptions of any non-standard practices. Field reports mentioned, among other things, wire guides welded around mantlets to aid correction of fire. Inquiries were made. Diagrams were requested. Eventually, copies of those diagrams found their way onto the desks of engineering officers and technical evaluators. When technical teams arrived to examine the frames directly, they brought with them measuring devices, cameras, and notebooks. They observed live-fire tests, watched gunners explain how the glow helped them, and noted the consistency with which crews praised the modification. From a purely analytical perspective, the frames were straightforward. They did not require redesigning the turret. They did not depend on new materials or complex machines. They added, in terms of weight and stress, almost nothing to the vehicle. Yet their contribution to gunnery precision, especially in high-stress scenarios, was both measurable and repeatable. All of this made the frames attractive to those whose job it was to improve equipment systematically. If something so simple could enhance performance across multiple units, there was a natural desire to formalize it, to incorporate it into standard designs where feasible. For the engineering officers, another question arose alongside the technical evaluation. Where had this idea originated? Field reports mentioned crews in forward units and informal improvisation. A few logs, more specific than others, referenced a loader in a particular armored division who had started the practice. His name appeared in maintenance notes, in margin scribbles, and in the recollections of people who had been there when the first frames were welded. Dale, however, remained at the front. He continued to serve with his crew, fighting through the last phases of the European campaign, focusing on the immediate tasks at hand: load, secure, support the gunner, and keep the tank in the fight. The conversations about official adoption and documentation were happening far away from his daily reality. As spring approached and the pressure on German forces intensified, engagement shifted from defensive stands to more mobile operations. Shermans with wireframes crossed rivers, advanced through towns, and supported infantry in clearing operations. Each time a Tiger or another heavy vehicle appeared, the crews relied on the same combination of experience, teamwork, and small metal lines that now felt like part of the tank's very identity. For crews who had never known their Shermans without frames, the idea of firing without that illuminated guide seemed strange. For those who remembered the early days, the difference in confidence was impossible to ignore. In private conversations, some officers began to speak in understated terms about a farm trick that had helped level a very uneven field. They did not always know the details of the origin story, but they recognized the practical outcome: more crews returning after encounters that once regularly ended in silence. When the fighting in Europe finally drew to a close and the long-awaited news of surrender spread across units, the Shermans that had carried wireframes into battle began to transition from instruments of war to symbols of experience. Some remained in service for a time, held in reserve or used for training. Others were eventually shipped back, scrapped, or turned into static displays. In each case, the wireframes faced an uncertain fate. Some were removed during refits. Others rusted quietly along with the tanks themselves, unnoticed by those who saw only the broader outline of the machines. Dale's own crew lived to see the end of their campaign. Cordell, Blake, and the rest of the men who had ridden with him in that steel compartment returned home with their own stories, memories, and silent reflections. For them, the wireframe modification was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible part of the way they had survived some of their hardest days. Back in Nebraska, Dale resumed a life that, on the surface, did not look dramatic. He returned to the familiar rhythms of farm work, tending to fields, repairing machinery, watching the changing seasons with the grounded patience that had surrounded his early years. The same skills that had guided his hands over a welding torch now returned to their original setting, fixing tractors and tools instead of armored vehicles. To neighbors and acquaintances, he was a quiet veteran who had served as a tank crewman. When asked, he would mention that he had been a loader in an armored division and that he had seen action in Europe. He rarely went further than that unless prompted, and even then, he spoke more about the camaraderie inside the tank than about specific innovations. It was not that he was hiding anything. He simply did not view himself as the centerpiece of a story. In his mind, he had seen a problem, applied knowledge he already had, and done what he could to keep his crew safer. That this effort had spread beyond his own tank, beyond his own battalion, was something he understood in practical terms but did not dwell on emotionally. Meanwhile, the official narrative that developed in reports and publications told its version of events. Technical documents described improvements to gunnery and accuracy. Engineering summaries credited institutional processes with refining field observations into standardized features. In those pages, the wireframes were mentioned as useful additions, but their origin was often generalized or attributed to departments rather than individuals. Years passed. New conflicts arose with different technologies, different vehicles, and different challenges. Tanks evolved, gaining advanced sights, stabilization systems, and electronic aids that would have seemed almost futuristic to crews of the 1940s. In the shadow of these advances, a simple welded rectangle of wire naturally slipped from prominence. But not completely. Somewhere in storage and archive rooms, boxes of wartime maintenance logs and after-action reports sat quietly, labeled with units and dates. Among those papers were work orders noting frame installed around mantlet per field practice, gunnery evaluations referencing improved grouping with wire guide present, and the occasional marginal remark mentioning a loader in 9th Armored who had started something useful. Decades later, long after the roar of those particular battles had faded, a military historian working on a study of field modifications came across one of those references. He had set out to explore how crews in various armies had adapted their equipment under pressure, searching for small changes that had outsized effects. The mention of wire frames caught his eye. Intrigued, he followed the breadcrumb trail from one document to another. Logs from different battalions spoke of similar frames. Some named divisions explicitly. Others referenced informal innovations that had been accepted at local levels. When he charted the timing and locations of the references, he saw a pattern, a cluster of early mentions centered on a particular armored unit and time period, then a spread outward. Some reports were more detailed than others. One maintenance log noted, with uncharacteristic flair, wire guide installed per PFC Hutchins design. Gunnery markedly improved in last engagement. Another contained a brief line, per loader's suggestion, mantlet frame added. Recommend trial across unit. The historian realized that this was not just a random quirk. It was an example of how a single practical idea could ripple through an entire system, carried not by formal directives at first, but by the conviction of people who had seen it work. He set out to find living witnesses. Through veteran registries and association newsletters, he located former crewmen from the units mentioned in the logs. Interviews filled in the gaps left by the documents. Retired tank commanders recalled the first time they saw the frames and the difference they made. Gunners described the moment when the wires flashed in their sights and the abstract concept of grouping shots clicked into a new level of clarity. Again and again, one name surfaced in their stories, the loader from Nebraska. They did not always remember every detail of his background, but they remembered that he had come from a farm, that he understood metal, and that he had been the first to risk altering the face of his tank. Eventually, the historian found Dale himself, by then an older man who still preferred to keep his hands busy in a workshop. He listened patiently as the visitor explained why he had come and what he had learned from the archives and interviews. When asked directly whether he had welded the first frame, Dale nodded. Yes, he said simply. It seemed like the right thing to try. The historian pressed a little further. Did he understand how widely the idea had spread? That hundreds of tanks had eventually carried some version of his frame? That aggregate analysis of unit records suggested a significant number of crews had returned from engagements they might not have, had the frames not helped focus their fire? Dale considered the information, then shook his head slowly. I hadn't counted, he replied. I knew our own crew came back. The ones I saw. I'm glad if more did. For him, the story had never been about an invention as such. It had been about an obligation to people whose voices he had once heard through the radio and then never heard again. The frame was, in his mind, one small answer to a question that had haunted him at the time. How do we stop seeing the same losses play out the same way? The historian eventually published his findings in a specialized journal focused on armored warfare. The article did not make major headlines. It did not shift the broad outlines of how the conflict was taught in schools or summarized in general histories. Instead, it found its audience among enthusiasts, veterans, museum curators, and those who like to look more closely at the small details behind large events. In that article, the wireframe was described not as a miraculous solution, but as a smart and practical adaptation. The author walked readers through the problem of engaging heavily armored vehicles with medium tanks that were, on paper, outmatched from the front. He explained how the frame did not change the physics of propulsion or metallurgy, but rather the geometry of aiming and adjustment. A few pages were devoted to the human side of the story. Interviews with former crew members painted a picture of a quiet loader with a good head for machines and a willingness to take responsibility for an idea. Comments from former commanders added depth, highlighting how the visible results of the frame had shifted attitudes in the field. One retired officer, who had commanded a company that adopted the modification early, summed it up in a way that resonated with many readers. We spent a lot of time waiting for solutions to come from somewhere else. Engineers, staff, new equipment. In the end, one of the most useful improvements we got came from a man who knew how to fix a tractor and wasn't afraid to weld something to his own tank. The article also noted that, by the time engineering departments evaluated the idea formally, it was already deeply embedded in field practice. Their subsequent recommendations to incorporate similar guides into official designs were, in some ways, acknowledgements of work that had been done months earlier under very different conditions. For Dale's family, who received copies of the piece from veterans and acquaintances, the article was both a revelation and an affirmation. They had always known that he had served under difficult circumstances, but now they saw in print how his particular contribution had been recognized, however belatedly, by specialists who studied such things for a living. Up to that point, the story of the wireframe had essentially lived in fragments. A maintenance note here, a recollection there, an improvised weld slowly rusting on a museum tank. The historian's work tied those pieces together and gave them a shape others could see. In army museums and armored displays, curators who read the article began to look more closely at the older vehicles in their care. On one Sherman, preserved from a unit that had fought in the same regions where Dale's battalion had operated, a curator noticed 4 faint metal segments around the gun mantlet. They were almost seamless with the surrounding metal, blended by time and paint. But once you knew to look for them, they were unmistakable. The museum's descriptive plaque mentioned field modifications common late in the war, adding a note about aiming guides developed by crews. It did not carry a specific name, but those who had read the article could see the connection. To the casual visitor walking past the tank, those 4 metal lines might still go unnoticed. To a more attentive observer, they became an invitation to imagine the crew inside that turret, working under pressure, trying to make each shot count a little more than the last. The story of the wireframe, in this way, mirrored the stories of many small wartime innovations. It did not dominate headlines. It was not the kind of development that reshaped national strategy in one sweeping stroke. Instead, it fit into the countless quiet decisions that collectively shift outcomes. A better way to check equipment, a more effective formation, a habit developed in one platoon and adopted by another. When people talked about grand strategy and major offensives, such details might be mentioned, at most, as brief examples. Yet for the individuals whose lives were tied directly to those details, they mattered profoundly. In conversations between veterans, the tone around the wireframes was often personal. Crews would recall specific engagements where the frame had helped them stay one step ahead, however small that step might have been. They would remember the first time they saw the wires glow and realized they could finally see what had previously been guesswork. For Dale, hearing that his story was now part of a published record brought a quiet sense of closure. It did not change the past, but it ensured that a piece of it would not be entirely dependent on fading memory. It gave future readers, people who might never set foot in a tank, a way to understand how much difference persistence and practical thought could make, even in an environment defined by machines and orders. Standing in front of a Sherman on display years later, a visitor might trace a finger along the metal of the turret and stop, puzzled, at the small L-shaped segments welded around the gun mantlet. The museum label would mention that these were remnants of an aiming aid devised in the field, used to improve the accuracy of rapid follow-up shots. It might not mention who had installed them on that particular vehicle. It might not list every crew that had used them or every engagement in which they had played a role. But behind those understated words lay a chain of events that began with a single loader who stayed awake one winter night, thinking about steel, farm tools, and the gap between what his tank was supposed to do and what it needed to do to protect the people inside. The story of the wireframe is, at its core, a story about how innovation often happens in moments of discomfort rather than comfort. It emerges when people cannot accept that this is just how it is and instead ask, what if there's another way? It rarely arrives with fanfare. More often, it starts as someone picking up a length of wire or a piece of scrap and seeing potential where others see ordinary clutter. In the broader narrative of the conflict, many such stories exist. Some are well known: breakthroughs in code breaking, large-scale engineering projects, new vehicles, and weapons. Others, like Dale's wireframe, operate at a smaller scale. They are tailored not to entire armies but to specific crews in specific situations. Yet the impact of those smaller innovations can ripple outward. In Dale's case, his attempt to fix a problem on his own tank gradually evolved into a practice that unit after unit adopted. It shifted not only their equipment, but also their mindset. The wireframe invited gunners to think of each shot as part of a deliberate sequence rather than a solitary attempt. It gave loaders and mechanics a sense of ownership in how their tanks performed. It reminded commanders that listening to ideas from every corner of their formations could yield unexpected benefits. The fact that recognition for such contributions sometimes arrives late, or in quiet ways, does not diminish their significance. A line in a technical journal, a small note on a museum plaque, or a recorded interview in an archive can preserve stories that would otherwise fade away entirely. In passing them on, historians and curators allow future generations to see that the outcome of major struggles often rests on countless individual decisions. For viewers learning about this story today, perhaps watching an animated map or listening to a narration, the key takeaway may not be the exact thickness of armor or the precise welding pattern of the frame. Instead, it might be the realization that even in systems that seem rigid and hierarchical, there is room at the edges for thoughtful adaptation. A farm mechanic turned loader looked at a problem everyone else accepted as unsolvable and saw a narrow opening. He did not build a new engine or design an entirely new vehicle. He simply added 4 lines of wire and, in doing so, gave his crew and many others a way to narrow the gap between what was expected of them and what they could realistically achieve. The next time someone stands in front of a World War II tank display, or scrolls past an image of a Sherman in a documentary, they may not immediately notice the small details welded to its face. But if they pause for a moment and lean in, they might see the faint outline of a frame and understand that behind it lies a story of quiet determination, practical knowledge, and the willingness to act when it would have been easier to shrug and move on. In that sense, the legacy of Dale's stupid wire trick is not just the number of tanks that returned home or the engagements that turned out differently because of it. It is also the reminder that inside every seemingly ordinary role, there is space for insight. And that sometimes, the idea that changes the rhythm of an entire battlefield begins with a simple, stubborn refusal to accept that nothing more can be done.